Hello again. This video reviews a couple of poems that we have after the Tintern Abbey poem. These two are Ode to a Nightingale by Keats and Ode to the West Wind by Shelley. The prompts that go along with this one, let's see, for letter B, desire for personal freedom for Ode to a Nightingale. Also, seeing nature as a retreat from one's troubles, and feeling isolated from society and a desire for solitude. For Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, that one goes with number 1, love of the power of nature. Number 2, desire for personal freedom. So those are the topics that go with these two poems we're taking a look at in this video. So let's take a look on page 571 at Ode to a Nightingale by Keats. We remember that John Keats suffered from tuberculosis toward the end of his life. He died when he was only 25 years old. And so he was staying with a friend, and he heard a nightingale while Keats was sitting in the garden, trying to write some lines, composing some poetry. Keats was a really good first draft poet. He could do something really well the first time and not have to go back and edit too much. And so as he listens to the song of the nightingale, then he realizes the end. He was trained as a pharmacist and a medical doctor. And so John Keats knew that once he got the tuberculosis, he probably was not going to live very long, and he didn't. And so he thinks, wouldn't it be a wonderful way to go if I could simply go to sleep here, listening to the song of the nightingale, smelling all these wonderful flowers all around me here in this pretty garden, and not have to suffer the way he had watched his mother die of tuberculosis when John was 12. His younger brother Tom, whom he practically worshipped, had died just a few months earlier. He had caught it from Tom, but they didn't know it back then that consumption, or tuberculosis as they called it, was catching. And so he caught it from his younger brother. And so he says, my heart aches in a drowsy numbness, it pains my sense as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains, one in it past, and leathwards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, like winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. So he calls the bird a spirit, a dryad here, a wood nymph, if you will. And he says, I feel kind of out of myself while I'm sitting here, and I'm listening to your song, and I'm not really jealous of you, bird, but you just kind of take me away from my thoughts and my feelings and my hurt, the condition that I'm in right now. And he even thinks in part 2 about a drink, a wine, that could even take him out of his poor sick body even more so. And his spirit is still free. You know, he still feels as energetic in his soul as he ever was. But his young sick body is starting to fail him. And he expresses that to us. A lot of people love that about Keats. Keats lets you in. He lets you know what he's feeling. He's not afraid to express that. Some people don't like that. Some people think he's too whiny, that he tells you too much about what he's feeling. So it just depends on personal preference there. But Keats really is not afraid to share in his poetry exactly what he's feeling in his body and his soul. It seems the bird starts flying away early in the poem. Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known. The weariness, the fever, and the fret here, where men sit and hear each other groan. Where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs. Where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. Where but to think is to be full of sorrow. So he thinks about his younger brother in that line there. And he thinks about older people too, getting old and getting sick. He says, you don't know anything about that, bird. He says, you can't really appreciate what we humans go through down here. And so in part 4, he goes away and he says, I want to fly away with you, but I don't have Dionysus or Bacchus in his leopard-drawn chariot in mythology to take me away. But what he does have is his writing, his poetry, but on the viewless wings of poesy. That's what helps him escape. So his art form is that which takes him away. He cannot see what flowers are at his feet, he says. Now, in real life, it was in the morning when he sat in the garden, but in the poem, he makes it at nighttime. So he pretends he can't see what the flowers are, but he can smell them. He can still hear the bird's song as the bird fades away. Darkling I listen, part 6, and for many a time I've been half in love with easeful death, and called him soft names in many amused rhyme. So death to him is not really scary. He's watched death occur too many times in his family really to be scared about it. But then in part 7, he says, well, this isn't fair to think about death with this creature of nature that represents life. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. But, he says, I bet even Ruth from the Bible, taken out of her homeland, got homesick every now and then. So I bet the bird song, he says, has reminded a lot of people of things that aren't really associated with a bird. But then in the last part, he says, forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. Adieu, goodbye. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she's fain to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu. Thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? So it ends on a very dreamlike way, where he's not really even sure if there had been a bird there, or maybe he had dreamed the whole thing. We have a much different kind of poem. They're both odes. They're both very formal lyrics, a rhymed or unrhymed lyric, often in the form of an elaborate address characterized by noble and lofty tone and style. But we have that same kind of serious poem in Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, but a much different situation. If you take a look at this, Shelley's West Wind is divided into 5 sections. If you count the lines, there are 14 lines apiece. They're sonnets. So it's a sonnet sequence that we have here. To Shelley, though, the wind is a symbol of power, and he sure wishes he had that power in his own writing. And so he wonders what the secret is that nature has that people don't have sometimes. So in the first part, he thinks about the west wind stripping the leaves off the trees in the fall. But also, the wind blows the new seeds around. So he calls it a destroyer and a preserver. It's a very strong thing that can both destroy and create life. He says, in wind, you can do it. In part 2, though, the wind blew up a storm. So he thinks about how powerful the storm can be. But we need storms. Part 3, what do storms do? They feed the waterways. And so water continues life. So this wind is part of this life cycle that we all have. Part 4, here he wishes he had that power for himself. If I were a dead leaf, thou mightest bear, back in part 1. If I were a swift cloud to fly with thee, he thinks about part 2. A wave to pant beneath thy power, that's from part 3. And share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou, O uncontrollable, if even I were as in thy boyhood, and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven. So when he was a child, maybe he flew kites, maybe that was his connection to the wind, or maybe he sat back and made out shapes in the clouds. He said, I was like your companion when I was a kid. But now that he's an adult, he's grown beyond such things. And so he says, now look at the human condition. I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. A heavy chain of hours has imprisoned one, chained one that's a lot like you, tameless and swift and proud. And Shelley was somewhat of a wild child, and a wild adult too. And so he says, I'm kind of like you, wind. I am wild in my spirit. But Shelley's earthbound. And so he can't fly away with the wind any more than Keats could fly away with his Nightingale. Therefore, in part 5, he says, so make me thy lyre, even as the forest is. So when the wind whips through the trees in the forest, it sometimes makes music. He says, do that to me. Influence me. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe. Maybe he's got writer's block. So he says, whatever you need to do, strip my dead leaves away from me and renew me the same way you renew nature. Do it. Come on. Scatter. As from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks my words among mankind. Oh, now we know the result. We know what he's really after. He wants to be a good writer. So he, like Wordsworth, wants nature to influence him to help him be a better writer, so that other people can listen to him and hear him. Scatters from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks my words among mankind. Be through my lips to unawakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. And then we have a very famous line here, and a very optimistic line too. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? So he hopes that if he is going through some kind of winter, maybe in his life, he had some problems, maybe in his writing, maybe he had writer's block, Whatever the situation is, whatever winter time that he's feeling right now, he has confidence that nature will help remind him springtime's around the corner. Things do get better.